Big spoilers for Elbath ahead. However, recently Sanji has been pitted against a Holy Knight, specifically Remo Shifu, killing him with the powers of the Dragon Fruit mythical type model Kirin. People thought that he should be a better matchup for Summers, and I see why, because he actually managed to burn Summers' vines in a previous chapter. However, what if I told you fighting Killingham is actually a part of a weird theme of Sanji's fights throughout the series? Because in most of his major fights, and some of the lesser ones in which he's just a participant, Sanji fights a lot of food and animal themed foes. Don't believe me? Well, in the Baratier arc, he ends up fighting Gin and Pearl. Gin is a starving man, so his whole story is about his crew not having food and Sanji feeding him, right? Okay, if you ask me, I consider that food themed. Then when you look at Pearl, well, Pearl is literally covered in pearls, right? And a pearl comes from an oyster. Therefore, he is animal themed. Moving on, however, we come to Arlong Park, in which Sanji fights Karubi. Of course, Karubi is a fishman, specifically a ray fishman, but following him, we come to Little Garden, in which Sanji fights a literal otter and a literal vulture in Miss Friday and Mr. 13. But that brings us to the Alabasta arc, in which Sanji fights Mr. 2, otherwise known as Betham, and he is an animal-themed character because his theme is the swan, and he actually uses the swan heads on his back in his fight with Sanji to extend his kicks, making the swan head come out like a rifle shot, powerful enough to drill holes in stone walls. So that's pretty cool. But coming off of Alabasta going into Skypiea, Sanji, Luffy, and Usopp fight Satori. Satori, during the Ordeal of Balls, uses cloud balls with a variety of things in them. Some of those things include animals like crabs and birds and a snake. So I would consider him animal themed as well. On top of that, he is a Birkin, which is a type of sky person. And I've often said that sky people most likely fall into the same category of like beast people in One Piece, kind of like Fishman and Mink, because I equate them to being the bird people of One Piece, if that makes sense. That's not official or canon. That just makes logical sense to me personally. But to continue, after Skypiea, we got the Davy backfight, in which, along with Zoro, Sanji fights Pickles, Hamburg, and Big Pan. All of them are food themed, obviously, because you use a big pan for cooking. Hamburg comes from Hamburg steak or hamburger, and Pickles comes from pickles. So that's pretty easy. But after that, Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji confront Admiral Aokiji or Kuzan. Kuzan's epithet, Aokiji, just means blue pheasant. Therefore, he is animal themed. Following that, we come to Water 7, in which Sanji fights Jerry on the sea train. Now, at first glance, Jerry might not seem to be animal or food themed, but he is in a very odd way. You see, due to Jerry being so tall, he has trouble fighting in cramped spaces. So he has learned yoga in order to compensate. The yoga pose that he does on the sea train is called the pretzel pose. A pretzel is a type of food. Therefore, in a very odd way, and seeing as how this is the bulk of his personality in this way, he is food themed. Following him, we have another food themed person in Wazani, whom uses ramen in order to fight, and he fights Sanji in the train's kitchen. So, in him using ramen to fight, he is food themed. Following both of them, we actually have Bluno, because Sanji does have a short confrontation with Bluno. Bluno, like the rest of the CP9 agents, is animal themed, and his theme is the bull. Following all of that, we come to Enies Lobby. In Enies Lobby, Sanji fights both Khalifa and Jaguar. Khalifa's main theme is the sheep, in which she uses her soap fruit abilities to look like a sheep. Therefore, she is animal themed. And we have Jaguar, who can become an actual wolf thanks to the powers of the dog fruit model wolf. Following Enies Lobby, we come to Thriller Bark. In Thriller Bark, Sanji fights the disgusting pervert known as Absalom. Absalom is a gross concept to think about because he has a bunch of animal muscular tissue and a lion's muscle grafted onto his body. And in that way, he is animal themed. At the end of the arc, Zoro and Sanji confront Bartholomew Kuma. Bartholomew Kuma is animal themed because he is literally named Bear, and due to the tufts of hair that stick out of his head and his hat, he is bear themed. In Sabaody Archipelago, it's the same story, as the main antagonists primarily are Bartholomew Kuma, the Flying Fish Riders, and a pacifista. Of course, Bartholomew Kuma, again, is bear themed, as are all the pacifista, and the Flying Fish Riders, along with Duval, are animal themed because they ride on flying fish and Duval rides on a bison. Following them, we come to the time skip. During their return to Sabaody Archipelago, Sanji and Zoro defeat another pacifista, which of course is bear themed. Following that, they make their way to Fishman Island, in which they encounter Surumi the Kraken, of which Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji fight, and of course a kraken is an animal. Following that, in the events of Fishman Island, the crew find themselves pitted against Hody and Vanderdecken along with their subordinates. Jinbei and Sanji end up fighting Watatsume. Watatsume is a fishman, specifically a tiger blowfish fishman, and he is defeated by the efforts of Sanji and Jinbei. But following Fishman Island, we enter Punk Hazard. And in Punk Hazard, Sanji doesn't have a whole lot of fights, but he does have a very interestingly significant one. And it's not even like a full fight, it's just a small skirmish, but he does end up fighting Virgo. Now, Virgo, for some reason, has the funny gag of food constantly being stuck to his face. Therefore, he ends up being food themed. After leaving Punk Hazard, we enter Dressrosa, of which Sanji doesn't really fight anybody, but he does have a significant clash with Don Quixote do Flamingo, and of course, Don Quixote do Flamingo is flamingo themed. In Zou, Sanji does fight the gifter known as Sheepshead, whom is a smile user and therefore is animal themed, and he is a sheep smile, so there's that. But going into Whole Cake Island, Sanji does fight his father, Vinsmoke Judge. Now, Vinsmoke Judge is kind of interesting because while he and the Germa aren't exactly food themed, it's because of his neglect and tyrannical rule that Sanji does end up escaping the Germa, and Vinsmoke Judge allows him to leave, and therefore he is allowed to go off and become a proper chef, eventually under the tutelage of Zeph. Therefore, I would say Vinsmoke Judge does count in this regard because he is a part of Sanji's journey into becoming a proper chef. He also ends up fighting Luffy, his captain, during this arc, and seeing as how Luffy brought him on originally as the chef, they have had a food-related bond throughout the entirety of the series. Therefore, in this way, Luffy is food-themed, you could say. But during the escape of Whole Cake Island, Sanji does have a skirmish with a few different members of the Charlotte family, namely Charlotte de Fuku and Charlotte Raisin. Charlotte Raisin is named Raisin. Raisin is a type of food. And Charlotte Daifuku is the Minister of Beans. Even though he has the power to summon a magic genie from his belly, he is the Minister of Beans, so therefore he is food themed. Now, when you get to Wano and Elbaf, they are the most interesting out of the entire roster of fights Sanji has had throughout the series, because when you consider all the other opponents, especially the animal-themed ones, all of them have just been regular animals, like swans and bears and wolves and etc. But In Wano and then later in Elbaf, he's hunting very exotic game, you could say, because in Elbaf and in Wano, he's fighting creatures that you don't normally encounter in the world, such as dinosaurs, which we do know that dinosaurs do exist in One Piece on Little Garden. But it is interesting that throughout the series, he hasn't had to fight an agent-type Zoan Fruit user until we get to Wano, those being Page 1 and Queen. And of course, he has to rely on Robin to fight Black Maria, whom's also an agent-type Zoan Fruit user. But I do find it interesting that in this escalation, both, especially against, I guess you could say all three of them really, Sanji has these big character moments. In fighting Page 1, he relies on the raid suit. The raid suit modifies him without him knowing once he wears it. That then leads to him relying on Robin to defeat Black Maria, which is good because he's relying on a crewmate to help him out. But that leads to him having a bit of an internal crisis when fighting Queen, because all those times he wore the raid suit are coming to fruition in his own body, and he actually mutates and develops into a mutant, a more advanced mutant than any of his siblings were. And he has to overcome that and overcome the weird amalgamation of his family that Queen is, with all the different abilities that he has from the various Germa suits, in order to embrace himself as a weird mutant and utilize what he's been given in order to become more powerful and therefore develop Ifrit Jumbe, therefore giving him the ability to pretty much literally cook the exotic beast that is Queen and being a Brachiosaurus. So I find that a very interesting development, that this game hunting that you could say that Sanji's been going through the entire series comes to a head in Wano and continues in Elbaf, because now we are in a very similar situation in which Sanji is hunting very exotic game. For the first time, he is hunting a creature that doesn't normally exist, with Remo Shifu Killingham being a Kirin. So he is hunting exotic game, but this exotic game cannot be hunted unless Sanji becomes a king. He becomes a conqueror and unlocks Conqueror's Haki, because Conqueror's Haki is the only thing that can put down a Holy Knight imbued with the Depths Covenant from Emu, thus having immortality. So now he has to overcome himself again in order for another very difficult hunt to be completed. So that's why I say it's very interesting that all of Sanji's opponents are either food themed or animal themed, because at least for the animal themed ones, each fight seems like a hunt for Sanji, which makes a lot of sense because in being a chef, he usually is the one preparing food and preparing animals to become food. So in a way, that all makes sense. So I find that a very interesting theme for Sanji's fights throughout the entirety of the series. But with that being said, if you are enjoying the video so far, click the like button. And if you want to see more from me, click the subscribe button, followed by that bell so you never miss a video. In addition to, if you could, hit the hype button because it really does help. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's